In this lecture recital, I will be examining and analyzing 6 specific musical settings of the poem En Sourdine, translated as softly or quietly, authored by French poet Paul Verlaine, in his collection of works entitled Fête Galante, meaning courtship party or gallant festival, which was published in France in 1869. Although there are more than a dozen song settings of this specific poem, I have chosen not only the most popular, but also some of the most harmonically and melodically interesting arrangements. The 5 composers of the settings are Renaud Hahn, Gabriel Fauré, Eugene Lacroix, Auguste Carré, and 2 settings by Claude Debussy. The songs themselves span the course of 76 years, and each contains similarities and unique differences, of which I will explore and review. First, let us take a closer look at the author of this poem. Paul Verlaine was born on March 30th in 1844. He received his secondary education in Paris and quickly retained a job as a civil servant in the city. Discovering a deep love of poetry as a child, he began writing at an early age. His first poem was published in 1863 in a French magazine. While in his mid-20s, Verlaine was a subsequent staple at various local salons, mingling with the great artistic minds of the time, including French inventors, humorists, anti-bourgeoisie idealists, and renowned authors. His first collection of poetry, published in 1866, spotlighted him as an up-and-coming poet with great potential and particular style. 3 years later, he published a collection of 22 poems entitled Fête Galante. This relatively short collection contains a variety of metered forms, which paint decadent scenes of seduction with an idealized countryside of lovers' banter, primarily characterized by actors from Italian commedia dell'arte, a popular form of 16th century Italian theater, performed mostly by masked professionals and comedians. Although the collection was met with graciously mediocre and unimpressed contemporary reviews, later consideration lauded the poems as derivatively depictive of the waning days of the Second French Empire and proudly saturated in a decorative Rococo literary style. It is worth noting that Paul Verlaine proceeded to lead an exceptionally turbulent life. After marrying his lover, Mathilde Montet, in 1870, he joined the National Guard shortly before becoming a member of the Paris Commune, which failed to oust the Prussian occupation and establish a new French government. He escaped the infamous Bloody Week, which killed 18,000 Parisians, and went into hiding, only to return to Paris the following year. At this time, Verlaine began a torridly intimate relationship with fellow French poet Arthur Rimbaud, who was 17 years old at the time. Here they are pictured together. Verlaine eventually abandoned his wife and son for Rimbaud, and the two absconded to London. A year later, Verlaine shot Rimbaud, barely injuring his wrist while engulfed in a drunken, jealous lover's rage. He was immediately arrested and imprisoned in Belgium, where the incident occurred. During his incarceration, he converted to Roman Catholicism, which incidentally influenced his later works, to the sharp criticism of Rimbaud. After departing Belgium, Verlaine continued to produce collections of poetry, mostly invoking vividly passionate nostalgia from his past life with Mathilde. He proudly cultivated a significant period of his life as an academic teacher in England and later in France. Sadly, during Paul Verlaine's final years, he perished within the grips of a drug addiction, alcoholism, primarily absinthe, and poverty. Despite a national admiration and revival of his works in the 1890s, his drug-dependent and impoverished lifestyle overshadowed his affably eccentric public appearances. He was officially entitled France's Prince of Poets by his peers in 1894, 2 years before his death. En Sourdine appears towards the tail end of his Fête Galante collection, ordered 21 out of 22, which appropriately and decidedly draws the work to a reflectively calm and affectionate sense of longingness after a florid pastiche of deep-hearted reverie and unquenchable desire. The 22-poem collection has been scholarly insinuated to be influenced by the early 18th century Rococo French painter Antoine Watteau, who we have just seen some of his paintings, who is credited for inventing the ethereal genre of fête galante through his artistic depiction of bucolic scenes and idyllic charm, most notably through the world of Italian commedia dell'arte. Verlaine's nod to heavy romanticism and tradition is not lost within the form of this poem, holding itself to 5 short quatrains in iambic meter. The poem contains an uneven number of feet, in this case 7. Although the rhyme scheme is a common ABA pattern, his placement of caesuras is varied within each subsequent line. They initially lie after the second syllable in the first line, after the fourth syllable in the next verse, and continue their asymmetric occurrences. The words themselves contain a kind of syllabic beauty, encompassing extended vowel and soft consonants, found, for example, within the fourth stanza upon words nous, souffler, doux, roux, persuader, and gazon. The use of double consonants, such as calme, and carefully selected vowel sounds allow Verlaine to masterfully control the pacing and weight of each phrase. Syncopated inner rhythms are exploited as a device to exemplify highly evocative imagery in the verses. And now a reading of the poem. Calme dans le demi-jour, que la branche haute fond, pénètre bien notre amour de ce silence profond, fondant nos âmes, nos cœurs, et non sans s'extasier parmi les vagues longueurs des pins et des arbousiers. Ferme tes yeux, Adami, crois tes bras sur ton sein, et de ton cœur endormi, chasse à jamais tout dessein. Laissons-nous persuader au souffle berceau doux, qui vient attirer les ondes de gazon doux. Et quand solennel le soir, de chêne noir tombera, vois de notre désespoir, le rossignol chantera. Sardine reflects the momentary refuge of nature for lovers from worldly suffering, displayed among the preceding love games in Verlaine's series of fantasies, which ultimately comes to a close, solitary and disparaged, within the lines in the old lonely park and ice, hope fled, defeated to the black sky. From his famous final poem of the collection, Colique Sentimentale, the nightingale symbolizes disillusioned love, or the coming of dawn, which must end the serenity found in a moment of escape. The voice of our despair the nightingale shall sing. It is the permeating sense of youthful flirtations, worldly depictions, and erotic tensions that drew a multitude of musical composers to set this text to song. The first setting that I will perform is from Debussy's 1882 version of En Sourdine. Claude Debussy was a French Impressionist composer who lived from 1862 to 1918. A brilliant pianist, Debussy entered the Paris Conservatory at the age of 10, studying under the most brilliant theorists, performers, and singers of his time. As a young composer, he was intrinsically influenced by the French literary symbolist movement, preferring dissonances and untraditional and intervallic harmonies. Towards the end of his 11-year stint at school, Debussy befriended singer Marie-Lange Vasnier and her husband Henry. The couple supported Debussy emotionally and professionally for years, but most importantly, introduced him to the poems of Paul Verlaine, which directly inspired him to compose his first set of songs with voice and piano. In 1882, Debussy composed 11 vocal arrangements of poems, the majority from Verlaine, including his first setting of Clair de Lune and this setting of En Sourdine. It is generally believed that this young man Debussy was in love with the middle-aged Marie-Blanche Vasnier, for whom he wrote a number of melodies to sing. It is thought that she was a talented amateur singer with a light, high, flexible voice. This can be inferred by the high tessitura and florid nature of the songs Debussy composed for her. He dedicated the song cycle to her, Fête galante pour Madame Vasnier. Here is an autographed manuscript of this dedication. The first version, En Sourdine, although composed in 1882, was not published until 1944, and they're virtually unknown until over 60 years after it was written. Centering around E major, En Sourdine begins with a two-measure syncopated pattern that continues through the first stanza, juxtaposed against the primarily duple feel of the vocal line. Debussy deviates from our E major tonality with the second stanza, building tension with a triplet accompaniment pattern that delivers us the highest note of the piece fittingly on the word ecstasies. To emphasize the third stanza, the voice and piano perform in rhythmic synchronicity throughout a four-measure descending sequence, unlike what we have heard previously. The accompaniment then transitions to a repetitive two-note figure for the entirety of the fourth stanza, while the vocal line simulates the rocking breath and the waves of the russet lawn, with a simple one-measure rise and one-measure fall pattern, repeating until the last line, which slowly transitions into the last stanza, with a thickly scored piano interlude, trading measures of lilting eighth notes with rolling triplets. The first two lines of the last stanza harmonically echo the first lines of the second stanza, which recalls the emotional joining of souls text with the now despairing night shall descend from the black oaks text. Interestingly, he also lifts the exact melody and harmony from the beginning of the third stanza for the last line of the final stanza and repeats the text to finish the melodic sequence. Here we can see the repeat of the last line. Recalling our Nightingale song once more before the accompaniment repeats the syncopated introduction for the postlude. The next setting that I will perform is from Renato Hahn. Although born in Venezuela in 1874 to a German Jewish father and Venezuelan mother, Renato Hahn lived a majority of his life in France with his 11 other siblings. A child prodigy, Hahn regularly sang arias by Offenbach while accompanying himself on the piano. Similarly to Debussy, he entered the Paris Conservatory at the age of 10, studied alongside Ravel and Cortot under the professors Massenet, Gounod, and Cesson. Hahn was exceptionally inspired by the poetry of Victor Hugo and Paul Verlaine, and used their poems as a text for his first venture into composing songs with voice and piano, which, due to their instant popularity, rocketed Hahn into the elite artistic social circles of the time. Hahn's setting of En Sourdine comes from a collection of 7 songs entitled Sept Chansons Grises, which significantly were the first published collection of vocal works written between 1887 and 1890. Centering around A major, the setting begins with a dreamy, atmospheric 4-measure piano introduction, chromatically rising on beat 2 and falling on beat 4, creating a peaceful yet playful landscape. As opposed to Debussy, Hahn's melodic lines are less symmetrical within their 8-bar phrasing and fall somewhat low in the voice register. The melody is even less symmetrical in the second stanza, falling over only 5½ measures, which creates a tense, rushing sensation as the vocal line extends its climactic note on, once again, the word ecstasy. Here we can see the low setting of the text and the word ecstasy. Hahn depictively returns to the 8-bar phrasing in the third stanza with a lofty exchange of dialogue between the voice and piano until the last line of text, "Drive away all plans forever," where he inserts a 3/4 measure alongside a rallentando, intensifying the cadence to essentially echo the forever statement. The fourth stanza is effectively compacted into only 4½ measures, as is Hahn's intent to hurry through this text with an ascending triplet sequence in the melody and harmonically creating tension before returning to our dreamy chromatic piano accompaniment for the final stanza. The voice once again returns to a low register with less rhythmic intensity and finally delivers a beautiful leaping last high note from the nightingale as the piano interestingly echoes the previously heard motive of the fourth stanza, harmonically recalling the lines, "Let us surrender to the soft and rocking breath." southern French town in 1845, Fauré would spend most of his free time at a nearby chapel which housed a harmonium. With no early formal training, he continued to play for himself and an old blind woman who would listen and occasionally offer advice. Fauré was sent to study at the School of Classical and Religious Music in Paris. In 1861, Camille Saint-Saëns took over the piano and contemporary music studies classes, introducing Fauré to the exciting modern works of Wagner, Schumann, and Liszt. The two developed a lifelong relationship that would influence and support Fauré's future career endeavors. While still in school, Fauré began his venture into composing vocal works with piano. Starting in 1861, he wrote a series of songs primarily using the text of poems by well-known French Romantic writers. Over time, Fauré became one of the master composers of French art song or melody. In 1887, he published a setting of Clair de Lune, his first work using a poem by Paul Verlaine. He followed it with 17 settings of Verlaine's poems over the course of 9 years. In 1890, Fauré was provided a vacation to Venice for himself and a group of friends. Financed by the Princess Edmond de Polignac, it was on this holiday that he conceived of the Cinq Mélodies de Venise, for which his setting of On Sourdine is the second movement of 5. Reminiscent of Hahn, Fauré begins his setting with a simple one-measure lilting 16th note rhythmic arpeggiated pattern, ascending and descending on each beat centered in F-sharp major. Each line of the text corresponds with 2 measures symmetrically within the initial 8-bar phrase, and a small dotted 8/16th note motive is placed at the end of each line. Unlike the previous Debussy and Hahn arrangements, the word ecstasy is not emphasized with a high note, but rather with the ending of a descending phrase. Interestingly, he uses the word melon instead of fondant at the beginning of the second stanza. However, the meanings of the words translate to similar meanings, melon meaning to mix or mingle, and fondant meaning to merge or melt. Here is an image of this descending phrase as well as the change of text. In the third stanza, the piano transitions into a repetitive 1-beat descending 16th figure, while the melody sings a 2-measure sequence, interestingly emphasizing the weak beat words of each line: yours, arms, breast, heart, away, and plans with long notes. In the fourth stanza, the rhythmic motion slows down to draw out the emotion of surrender, while the piano tumbles across the waves with an intensifying ascending 16th note pattern. For the last stanza, Fauré augments the music along with the text to rhythmically retard into the final cadence. He uses 4 measures for the first 2 lines of text, 2 measures for the third line, and finally 2 measures for each of the halves of the last line, extending the final stanza into a 12-bar phrase. The highest note of the piece appears on the last word, chantera, to sing, as the piano's arpeggiated motives evaporate into the night. 1891 and published in 1903. This later publication, entitled Fête Galante I, includes revised versions of En Sourdine, Fantoche, and Clair de Lune. In that order, Fête Galante II, published a year later, includes 3 additional settings of Verlaine poems. While his initial setting of En Sourdine was written 9 years earlier, there are distinct similarities between the works, including the ratio of stanzas to measures of music, occasional absences of tonality, and extended syncopated piano accompaniment. This setting begins with a wavering syncopated 3-measure motive that is recalled later in the piece, aiding in melodic cohesion among untraditional harmonic modulations. To create a greater sense of tension, Debussy uses only 6 measures to compose the entire first stanza, and bandying rhythmic pauses between the lines. Although the work is written primarily in B major, the underlying chords alternate between a functional 1 chord with a suspended raised 4th and second inversion 1 chord, which orally doesn't set B major as the tonic. The vocal line lies low in the register and is mostly in stepwise motion to help echo the calming and quiet text. The second stanza continues the syncopated piano accompaniment, while the melody approaches a slight retard, drawing the first words of the 3rd line of the second stanza. Interestingly, Debussy inserts a singular 2/4 measure at the end of the stanza before changing to a 3/4 time signature for the 3rd stanza. He dictates for the tempo to quicken as the piano delicately performs a leaping arpeggiated triplet motive, ascending and descending within each measure. Following a 2-measure ascending triplet figure by the piano, the 4th stanza begins a slow building melody, floating underneath an insecure harmonic progression centering around D major and seemingly functionally unrelated 7 chords. However, the repetition of return to D major gives a sense of stability. The stanza ends on the highest note yet written within the work and begins to quietly return to our opening piano motive, providing the listener with aural bookends. Debussy returns to a 4/4 time signature and a slower tempo in the middle of the final stanza. The melody gradually rises and falls, echoing the last line from his earlier version. Pictured here is this last line, similar to the one we saw in his first version of En Sourdine. As the text comes to a close, the syncopated piano motive plays alone for the last 4 final measures. biographical information available. However, we do know that he was born in England in 1858 and moved to France at a young age. He was a member of the Industrial Society of Mulhouse and a Knight of the Legion of Honor. Lacroix was employed as the organist in Paris and performed with the long-standing Lamoureux concerts, an orchestral concert society that performed weekly concerts of new French music from 1881 onwards, including the 1905 premiere of Debussy's La Mer. His well-known compositional works are few, but include several works for flute and many arrangements of sacred music for organ. His setting of En Sourdine was published in 1898. Lacroix died at the age of 92 in 1950. His setting of En Sourdine opens with a melodically pleasing 10-measure piano introduction, the longest of the 6 settings. A repetitive 2/8 note descending motive sets the carefree landscape and primarily using wide leaping major 6 and eventually extends into 7ths and octaves as the vocal melody propels forward. Extending the musical stanzas further than Debussy, Hahn, and Fauré, Lacroix composes 15 measures of music to encompass the first stanza. Firmly grounded in A-flat major, the melody gradually rises to an elongated high F-flat, accordingly on the word alta, meaning high. He also emphasizes the last 2 words of the stanza, silence profound, with 4-measure musical extension that chromatically modulates downward through a slight rallentando, resolving back to A-flat major for the second stanza. Another 15-measure stanza, Lacroix echoes Debussy and Hahn's emphasis of the word extasier with a large intervallic leap and rhythmic elongation. The vocal melody is in a noticeably higher tessitura than the first stanza, creating a greater sense of passion, which reflects the text. The third stanza diminishes by half with only 8 measures, creating a seamless strain of text. A new accompaniment piano motive evolves from the descending intervals, this time adding descending chord tones with a syncopated rhythmic suspension at the end of each measure, which along with the newly hurried melody creates an emotional sense of urgency. The 5th stanza reaches a climactic moment quickly on the word solemnly with a high A half note. For the 3rd and final lines of the stanza, the piano accompaniment begins a similar figure as heard in the introduction, this time with ascending thirds instead of descending 6th. The final line ends, reaching an intensely impassioned moment, harmonically and dramatically before, in a twisted form, Lacroix repeats the 3rd stanza's text and music. Pictured here is the end of the song, which we can see that 3rd stanza's text. Instead of ending with the nightingale song, the listener is lulled back into the lover's plea to drive away all plans, as the opening piano motive briefly returns, ending the work. 1896. Although he showed an immense passion for music, performing at a local church from the young age of 11, he initially studied and received a law degree. Abandoning law for music, he became the organist at St. John Baptist Church in Montreal. He won the European Prize for Piano at the age of 25 and moved to Paris, where he lived for 9 years. He presented numerous recitals and devoted himself to his work as the organist and choir master, first in Paris and later back in Canada. In 1944, he joined the faculty at the University of Montreal as their piano teacher and music history professor. He was also president of the Quebec Musicians Association and vice president of the Diocesan Commission for Liturgical Singing. As a composer, Descartes was best known for his Canadian Rhapsody for piano and orchestra. He is also the author of a small symphony, many works for piano, mixed masses for voice, and melody. He published approximately 26 songs for voice and piano during his life, learning texts from a variety of poets, including his own writing. His setting of Paul Verlaine's On Sourdine was the last vocal work with piano that he published, 10 years before his death in 1958. Composed much later than the other 5 settings, Descartes' arrangement contains more traditional romantic constructs than his impressionistic and progressive French predecessors. This setting is the only one that begins and ends in a minor key, E minor, and there is no piano introduction. Restricted to symmetrical 8-bar phrasing, Descartes manages to emphasize certain words by using longer notes and higher tessitura. The first word, calme, lingers slowly, softly descending a fifth before quickly rising to a high G on the word high, similar to the effect used by Lacroix. The piano provides a soothing, quartal, arpeggiated 8th note rise and fall within each measure, slowly building a thicker texture as the text continues. After a slight retard at the end of the phrase, the accompaniment enters a mysterious syncopated bass line, similar to the opening of both Debussy's settings, during a 4-measure transition into the second stanza. A long stringendo occurs within the entire second stanza, beginning with an animando to the word extasier, and a final slentando over the last line of text before the accompaniment chromatically descends, modulating to A major. As the vocal line gently rises and falls within the first 3 lines of text, the piano breaks the phrase with a 2-measure figure that allows the vocalist to emphasize the last line of text, drive away forever all plans, an instructive, plaintive, and mournful delivery. The E minor tonality returns in the 4th stanza with a piano accompaniment similar to the beginning of the work. With the rise and falls of the accompaniment, Descartes musically emulates the rocking breath and the ripples and waves described in the text. A 2-measure transition introduces the final stanza with a legato right-hand Alberti bass figure that gracefully accompanies a rising and crescendoing vocal melody that suddenly delivers a high and subito pianissimo on the last word halfway through the final stanza. A 5-measure piano transition emotes its own reflective moment with an added caesura, then continues on to set up the last line. Here we can see that last line. Descartes indicates the last line to be sung declamato and animato, a sharp contrast to the piano and pianissimo dynamic levels of the previous settings. The melodic leaping 5th motive with an ornamental 16th note embellishment demonstrates the Nightingale song. It is the most elaborate and the strongest of the 6 Nightingale songs. This will be my last piece. Thank you all for coming.